If you enjoy comics of any sort, or you just want to know more about them, you should definitely read this book. Welcome to Mad on Books, where I talk about fantasy mostly, science fiction sometimes, and comics occasionally. Since I started my channel in August of 2022, I have said that numerous times, comics occasionally. However, I've never once actually talked about comics yet. Today's the first. And if I'm going to start with talking about comics, before I talk about any of the actual comics that I love, I thought I should definitely talk about Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud. This is, I think, a bit of an older edition. I have owned 5 or 6 copies of this book and I've given them all away. So this one looks really new, like I haven't read it, but I've read this multiple times. It's an amazing book. So we're not going to do What's It Got this time because it's not a typical story book. It's essentially, and don't run away, but it's essentially an academic study of what comics are and how they work. But that sounds boring, I know. But it's an academic study of comic books presented as a comic book. And Scott McCloud uses every single tool and trick in the comic artist, comic writer toolbox to exemplify and demonstrate all of the tricks that he's talking about. It gets into psychology of comics, how comics work on our minds, how the reader fills in the gap between panels, because a panel is always a still image of one period in time, and the next panel is a still image of another period in time. And there's a gap in there, usually called the gutter. And the gutter doesn't tell us anything about what happens in between. We fill that in our heads. And he gets into a lot of that psychology, also the psychology of how we relate to images of people. That when you create a very simplified image of a person, like in a lot of comics, it gives us a lot more space as a reader to project ourselves into it, to relate to that person, to fill in the details and make that image, in a way, our own, in our own heads. It's an amazing book. I read this when I was in university, when I was studying design, and it changed the way I think about a lot of visual work. And ever since then, I've made pretty much every person I've ever worked with as a designer, I've made them read it, or I've actually given them a copy. It also goes through the history of comics. So if you are interested in comics, once he's laid down sort of the groundwork for a lot of the, how do comics work? What kind of things are comics doing with our minds? What are they doing visually? What kind of tricks are they using? He also talks a little bit about Japanese comics, manga. It's most of the stuff he's talking about is focused on Western comics, but he does delve a little bit into manga. Once he's laid down the groundwork, he goes through a lot of the famous comic artists and writers in the past and shows how they've been using different things, where they fit sort of on the spectrum as far as what kind of details they're putting in their images or how simplified their images are. He also goes into the history of sequential images. That's images that tell a story in a sequence. So he, I think, names the Bayeux Tapestry as the first example because it's showing a particular battle and who did what, and it's also got text integrated with the images. So it's sort of a very far precursor to comics in a way. But the sequential combination of words and images are essentially what comics are. And he breaks it down in such a way that it will definitely make you think. And it'll make you think differently about a lot of visual communication that you see, but specifically also comics. So I super duper recommend this to anyone that's interested in comics at all to read it and think about it, and maybe then read it again. It's worth a reread. I've read it numerous times. It's one of my favorite comics that isn't a story. It's probably the only comic I own that isn't a story, but it's definitely my favorite of those. One of my favorite comics in general. Absolutely groundbreaking work. There's another one by Will Eisner, which was done before this, which is going in some of the same directions, but in quite a different way. But I definitely recommend this one. It's super easy to read. You could read it in an evening, and it will change the way you look at comics and make you much more aware of what's going on in them. It's excellent. So, short video today. I wanted to tick this one off the list before I talk about any other comics, because it's such a foundational work as far as I'm concerned. So as always, I hope you're doing well. Keep reading awesome comics, and I will see you next time.